It started with a promise about a blueberry muffin, a simple, ordinary promise from a father to his daughter on a sun-drenched Boston afternoon. Miles O'Connell, a carpenter whose hands were more familiar with wood grain than wealth, had no idea that this promise would lead him to a choice made in the space of a single heartbeat, with the crack of a gunshot as its soundtrack. He was just a single dad trying to give his little girl a happy memory. He never expected to become a hero, or that his life, and the life of one of the city's most powerful women, was about to change forever in 3 violent, world-altering minutes. The air in Copley Square, on that late August afternoon, was thick with the lazy hum of a city content in the sunshine. For Miles O'Connell, it was a stolen moment of peace. He sat on a worn wooden bench, his back to the grand stone facade of the Trinity Church, and watched his 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, chase a kaleidoscope of pigeons across the brick plaza. Her laughter was a bright, clean sound that cut through the city's drone. "Careful, sweet pea," he called out, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sophie, with her fiery red hair tied into a lopsided ponytail, skidded to a halt and grinned back, showing off the gap where her 2 front teeth used to be. "They're too fast, Daddy." "That's because they haven't had their lunch yet," he replied, tapping the small paper bag next to him. "Unlike us." Life for Miles and Sophie was a carefully constructed mosaic of simple joys and quiet struggles. His wife, Brenda, had passed away from a swift and merciless illness 2 years prior, leaving Miles to navigate the treacherous waters of single fatherhood. He was a carpenter by trade, a man who found solace in the scent of sawdust and the satisfaction of a perfect dovetail joint. But custom cabinetry jobs in Boston were competitive, and the bills were a relentless tide. Sophie's sneakers were a little too scuffed, their apartment in South Boston a little too small, but their world was filled with a fierce, protective love that wealth couldn't buy. Today was a rare treat. A client had paid in cash that morning, and Miles had decided to surprise Sophie with a trip to the Boston Public Library, followed by her favorite treat, a giant blueberry muffin from the little bakery on Dartmouth Street. "Can we get the muffin now?" Sophie asked, her pigeon chasing forgotten as she scrambled onto the bench beside him. "Patience, little one. First, we have to finish our people-watching game," Miles said, ruffling her hair. It was their favorite pastime. They would invent stories for the strangers who walked by. The man in the crisp suit was a secret agent. The woman with the bright pink hat was a famous artist. The college students sprawled on the lawn were studying magic. As Sophie scanned the crowd for their next subject, Miles's gaze drifted to another child, a little girl sitting on the steps of the library. She was about Sophie's age, with pristine blonde hair held back by a velvet headband and a dress that probably cost more than Miles's weekly groceries. She sat perfectly still, a stark contrast to Sophie's whirlwind energy, clutching a well-loved teddy bear and watching the world with solemn, intelligent eyes. A woman in a neat, professional uniform, a nanny, Miles presumed, stood a respectful distance away, her attention divided between the girl and her phone. He felt a familiar pang in his chest, a mix of admiration and a quiet, gnawing inadequacy. He could give Sophie all the love in the world, but he couldn't give her dresses like that, or the unspoken promise of a life free from financial worry. He shook the thought away. Comparison was a thief of joy, and their joy was too precious to be stolen. "Her," Sophie whispered, pointing a chubby finger toward the blonde girl. "She's a princess, Daddy, and her teddy bear is a prince that a mean wizard turned into a toy. She's waiting for a magic kiss to turn him back." Miles chuckled. "I like that. A princess waiting for magic." The princess, Lily, as he would later learn her name was, suddenly looked up, her gaze locking onto a man walking briskly across the square. He was unremarkable, dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans, but something about his posture was off. He was rigid, his eyes fixed with a burning intensity on the little girl on the steps. Miles was a man who noticed details. It was part of his craft. He noticed the way the man's hands were jammed deep into his pockets, the unnatural straightness of his path, the way he ignored the flow of the crowd, bumping into a tourist without an apology. A knot of unease tightened in Miles's stomach. It was the same feeling he'd get just before a saw blade bucked or a scaffold felt unsteady. It was the instinct of a man who understood that things could go wrong, terribly and suddenly. He saw the nanny finally look up from her phone, her brow furrowing in confusion at the approaching man. He saw the little girl, Lily, hug her teddy bear tighter, a flicker of fear in her wide blue eyes. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the city faded into a dull roar in Miles's ears. The man was now less than 30 feet from the girl. "Daddy," Sophie said, tugging on his sleeve, her voice small. "That man looks angry." Miles's body was already moving before his mind had fully processed the command. He stood up, his own protective instinct screaming. "Stay behind me, Sophie," he said, his voice low and firm. The man in the gray hoodie pulled his right hand from his pocket. It wasn't a wallet or a phone he was holding. It was a gun, a dull black piece of metal that seemed to absorb all the sunlight from the cheerful afternoon. Time stopped. A collective gasp rippled through the square, but no one moved. They were a tableau of frozen shock. The nanny screamed, a thin, useless sound. The man raised the gun, his arm steady, his aim precise. He wasn't looking at the nanny. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was pointing it directly at the small, blonde-haired princess on the library steps. Miles didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He didn't consider his own safety or the daughter hiding behind his legs. He saw only a child, small and terrified, about to be extinguished. In that fraction of a second, she wasn't a rich girl in an expensive dress. She was just a little girl, the same as his Sophie. He moved, 3 long strides. That's all it took. 3 powerful, desperate strides that closed the distance between his bench and the library steps. The world was a blur of motion, a cacophony of a single piercing scream that seemed to stretch into eternity. Miles's mind was a maelstrom of primal commands. Shield, protect, cover. He didn't shout a warning. There was no time. His only weapon was his own body. As he launched himself forward, he caught the little girl's eyes. They were wide with a terror no child should ever know. But in that fleeting instant, they registered him, a stranger, a sudden shadow eclipsing her world. He collided with her just as the first shot rang out. The sound was nothing like in the movies. It wasn't a boom. It was a sharp, ugly crack that tore through the fabric of the afternoon. It was brutally final. He wrapped his arms around the small, trembling body, pulling her down and twisting so his back would face the gunman, making himself the largest possible target. He felt the impact before he heard the second shot. It was a stunning, violent blow to his left shoulder, a white-hot poker that seemed to sear through flesh and bone. The force of it threw them both sideways, their bodies tumbling onto the hard granite of the steps. A cry of agony was ripped from his throat, but he swallowed it, his focus locked on the child in his arms. "It's okay," he grunted, the words tasting of copper. "I've got you. You're okay." The little girl, Lily, was silent, her face buried in his chest, her small hands clutching the fabric of his flannel shirt. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Lying on the cold stone, a searing pain radiating down his arm, Miles risked a glance over his shoulder. The gunman, a man later identified as Dr. Alaric Webb, a disgraced former researcher, seemed momentarily stunned by his interference. His plan had been derailed. Panic and fury warred on his face. He raised the gun again. This time the target was Miles. Miles tensed, instinctively curling himself tighter around the child, a silent prayer forming on his lips. Sophie. But before Webb could fire a third time, a different kind of sound erupted, the sound of a hero. A burly construction worker who had been eating his lunch nearby charged forward, swinging his metal thermos like a club. He bellowed with rage, a sound of pure, righteous fury. The thermos connected with Webb's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The weapon clattered to the ground. 2 police officers on foot patrol, drawn by the shots, were now sprinting across the plaza, their own weapons drawn, shouting commands that Webb, clutching his shattered hand, was in no state to obey. The immediate danger was over. But for Miles, a new battle was just beginning. The adrenaline that had propelled him began to recede, leaving in its wake an ocean of excruciating pain. His shoulder was on fire. A warm, sticky wetness was spreading across his back and chest. He tried to push himself up to check on Sophie, but his left arm was useless, and a wave of dizziness washed over him, making the blue sky tilt and spin. "Daddy!" He heard Sophie's frantic cry. It cut through the pain and the fog. He turned his head, his vision tunneling. He could see her, standing by the bench, her small face a mask of terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. A kind-faced woman with a pink hat, the artist from their game, had her arms around Sophie, keeping her back. "I'm okay, sweet pea," Miles managed to gasp out, the lie feeling heavy on his tongue. "Daddy's okay." He looked down at the little girl still huddled in his arms. He gently loosened his grip. "Are you hurt?" he whispered. She shook her head, her blonde hair falling across her face. She didn't speak, just stared at him, her blue eyes filled with a terrifying, adult-like understanding of what had just happened. She then looked down at his chest, at the crimson stain that was rapidly darkening the front of his shirt, his blood. A small whimper escaped her lips. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The world was coming back into focus, a chaotic scene of shouting people, crying, and the sharp, authoritative voices of the police. Paramedics were coming. Help was on its way. But the strength was draining out of him, flowing out of the hole in his shoulder. The edges of his vision began to go dark. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the little girl's face, her expression a mixture of fear and a strange, profound gratitude. The last thing he heard was the distant, thunderous sound of his own heart, beating a slow, heavy retreat. Summer Beaumont didn't run companies. She built empires. As the CEO and founder of Beaumont Innovations, a multi-billion-dollar biotech firm, her days were a meticulously scheduled ballet of board meetings, investor calls, and high-stakes negotiations. Her currency was data, her language was profit margins, and her armor was a collection of impeccably tailored designer suits. She was a fortress, built brick by brick after the sudden death of her husband, Robert, in a sailing accident 3 years ago. The only vulnerability in her formidable defenses was a 6-year-old girl with blonde hair and her father's solemn eyes. At 2:17 p.m. that Tuesday, Summer was in the middle of a tense video conference, dissecting the third quarter projections with her board. Her office on the 50th floor of the Prudential Tower offered a panoramic view of the city she dominated, but her focus was narrowed to the screen in front of her. Her personal phone, a device whose ringtone was known to only 4 people in the world, buzzed on the polished mahogany of her desk. She glanced at the caller ID, Maria, nanny, a flicker of annoyance. Maria knew not to call during board meetings unless it was a dire emergency. She muted the conference call. "Excuse me for one moment, gentlemen." Her voice was ice. She answered the phone. "Maria, this had better be important." What she heard was not Maria's calm, deferential voice. It was a hysterical sob. "Ma'am, oh God, Copley Square. A man. A gun." Summer's blood ran cold. The fortress crumbled. The CEO vanished, replaced by a mother. "Maria, talk to me. Where is Lily?" she demanded, her voice sharp as glass, cutting through the nanny's panic. She's safe," Maria choked out. "A man, he saved her. He got shot." "Oh God, Mrs. Beaumont, there's so much blood." Summer was already on her feet, grabbing her purse and keys. The faces of her board members on the screen stared back, their expressions morphing from confusion to alarm as they heard the raw terror in their CEO's voice. She didn't bother to end the call. She simply slammed the laptop shut and stormed out of her office. "Get the car, now," she snapped at her executive assistant, who scrambled to comply without asking a single question. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. Her mind was a high-speed reel of horrific possibilities. A gun. Shot. The words echoed in the silent, descending box. The 3-minute drive from the Prudential Center to Copley Square was the longest journey of her life. Her driver, trained for every contingency, navigated traffic with a skill that bordered on miraculous. But to Summer, the world was moving in slow motion. She was out of the car before it had fully stopped, pushing through the nascent crowd of onlookers held back by the first responding officers. She flashed her ID. "My daughter is in there! Lily Beaumont!" An officer, seeing the sheer, unadulterated panic in her eyes, waved her under the newly erected police tape. And then she saw it. The chaos. The paramedics working frantically over a man on a stretcher. The shattered construction worker's thermos on the ground, the weeping nanny being questioned by a detective, and sitting on the library steps, wrapped in a coarse police blanket, was Lily. Her small form was being shielded by a kind-faced female officer, but her eyes were scanning the scene, wide and vacant with shock. "Lily!" The sound of her mother's voice broke the spell. Lily's head snapped up, and the dam of her composure broke. She scrambled to her feet and ran, launching herself into Summer's arms. Summer fell to her knees on the hard brick, ignoring the bite of the stone, and crushed her daughter to her chest, burying her face in Lily's hair, inhaling the scent of her child, reassuring herself that she was real, solid, and alive. "Mommy," Lily sobbed, her little body trembling uncontrollably. "There was a bad man, a very bad man." "I know, baby, I know. You're safe now. I'm here. You're safe," Summer murmured over and over, rocking her daughter, her own tears blurring the chaotic scene into a watercolor of fear and relief. After a few moments, she pulled back, her hands framing Lily's face, her eyes scanning every inch of her for injury. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" Lily shook her head. "The other man saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The daddy." Summer frowned in confusion. "What daddy?" Lily pointed a trembling finger toward the stretcher that the paramedics were now loading into the back of an ambulance. "Him, the man with the little girl. He pushed me. The bad man hurt him instead." Summer's gaze followed Lily's finger. She saw a man, pale and unconscious, an oxygen mask over his face. His flannel shirt was drenched in blood, a terrifyingly vivid crimson against the plaid. She saw a tangle of reddish-brown hair, a strong jawline slack with unconsciousness. A stranger, a complete stranger, had taken a bullet for her child. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a final wail of its siren, it pulled away, disappearing into the city traffic. It was only then, as the immediate evidence of the violence was driven away, that Summer looked around and saw a small, red-haired girl standing with the woman in the pink hat. The girl was watching the departing ambulance, her tiny fist clenched, tears silently tracing paths down her freckled cheeks. It clicked in Summer's mind with the force of a physical blow. The man with the little girl. That was his daughter. The man who had just saved her world had a world of his own, and it was currently standing 10 feet away, utterly terrified and alone. The full weight of the day's events crashed down upon her. A man had nearly been murdered saving her daughter. Another little girl could have just lost her father. All while she was debating third-quarter projections in her ivory tower. The gratitude she felt was so immense, so overwhelming, it was physically painful. It was a debt she could never possibly repay. But as Summer Beaumont looked from her own daughter to the hero's weeping child, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she had to try. The waiting room at Massachusetts General Hospital was a sterile, impersonal purgatory. For most, it was a space defined by the drone of a television news report, the scent of antiseptic, and the slow, agonizing tick of the clock. But that evening, it became the unlikely intersection of two vastly different worlds. Summer had used her name and influence like a battering ram. Within minutes of arriving, she had secured a private waiting suite, a quiet beige room with comfortable chairs and a dedicated hospital liaison. Lily, after being checked over by a pediatric specialist and given a clean bill of health, was now quietly drawing in a corner with a set of crayons provided by a nurse. The trauma temporarily held at bay by a child's resilience. Maria, the nanny, sat silently, her face pale with shock and guilt. But Summer couldn't sit. She paced the room like a caged panther, her mind racing. She had learned the man's name, Miles O'Connell. The hospital staff, at her firm insistence, had given her the basic details. He was in surgery, a single gunshot wound to the shoulder. The bullet had missed major arteries but had shattered part of his clavicle. He was stable, but the damage was severe. Her liaison entered the room. "Mrs. Beaumont, Mr. O'Connell's sister is here. She's in the main waiting area." "Bring her here," Summer said immediately. A moment later, a woman who was the mirror image of the man on the stretcher walked in. She had the same reddish-brown hair, though hers was pulled back in a messy bun, and the same determined set to her jaw. Her eyes, however, were red-rimmed and blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. This was Fiona O'Connell, a second-grade teacher from Dorchester and Miles's older sister. Sophie stood beside her, clinging to her aunt's hand, her face tear-stained and exhausted. "Are you the mother?" Fiona asked, her voice tight. There was no deference, no awe of the impeccably dressed woman before her. There was only the raw concern of a sibling. "Yes, I'm Summer Beaumont," Summer said, her own voice softer than usual. "This is my daughter, Lily." Sophie and Lily looked at each other from across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two children who now shared a terrible, indelible bond. "They told me what Miles did," Fiona said, her voice cracking on her brother's name. "They said he's in surgery. Is he?" "The doctors say he's stable," Summer supplied quickly. "They have the best orthopedic surgeon in the city working on him. I've made sure of it." Fiona's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've made sure of it?" The unspoken accusation hung in the air. "You and your money," Summer understood. To this woman, she wasn't a grateful mother. She was the reason her brother was lying on an operating table. "I mean," Summer corrected herself, humbled, "I just want to ensure he gets the absolute best care. Any expense, anything at all is taken care of. His medical bills, his recovery, his lost wages, everything. Please, you must not worry about any of that." Fiona just shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "That's what people like you do, isn't it? Write a check. Miles. He's not a business transaction. He's a good man. The best man I know. He's all Sophie has." Her gaze softened as she looked down at her niece. The words stung, but Summer knew they were deserved. She had treated it like a problem to be solved with resources. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is a hero, and I am in his debt, a debt no amount of money can ever repay. But I can, at the very least, remove the financial burden this has placed on him, on your family." Before Fiona could respond, a surgeon in blue scrubs entered the suite. "Mr. O'Connell's family?" Fiona and Summer both stepped forward at the same time, then stopped. Fiona gave a slight nod, conceding the floor to the surgeon, but her eyes never left his face. "The surgery was a success," the doctor announced, and a collective silent sigh of relief filled the room. "We removed the bullet fragments and repaired the damage to the bone and surrounding tissue. He's lost a lot of blood, and he's in a great deal of pain, but he's strong. He's being moved to a private recovery room in the North Wing. He'll be groggy for a while, but you can see him in about an hour." The North Wing. Summer knew it well. It was the VIP floor, with rooms that looked more like luxury hotel suites than hospital rooms. She had arranged it without a second thought. Fiona, however, looked confused. "The North Wing? But his insurance—" "There is no need to worry about insurance," Summer stated, leaving no room for argument. "He is my guest." An hour later, Fiona and Summer stood outside Miles's room. The two girls, exhausted by the day's events, had fallen asleep in the waiting suite, curled up on opposite ends of a sofa. "You go first," Fiona said, her voice rough with emotion. I think he needs to see you're okay. The woman I need a minute anyway." She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth, her composure finally breaking. Summer's heart ached for her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glowing monitors beside the bed. Miles O'Connell lay pale against the white pillows, his chest bare except for a thick bandage covering his shoulder and a web of wires monitoring his vitals. An IV drip was taped to his hand, the hand of a craftsman, she noticed, with its calloused fingers and neatly trimmed nails. He looked younger than he had on the stretcher, more vulnerable. His face, relaxed in a medicated haze, was handsome, with strong lines and a scattering of light freckles across his nose. As she approached the bed, his eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were a startlingly clear hazel, clouded with pain and confusion. They found her, and a flicker of recognition dawned. "The little girl," he rasped, his voice dry and weak. "Is she—" "She's safe," Summer whispered, moving closer. She reached out, hesitated, and then gently placed her hand on his uninjured arm. His skin was warm. "She's perfectly fine. Thanks to you. My daughter Lily," She's safe because of you." A small measure of tension seemed to leave his body. He closed his eyes for a moment. "And my daughter, Sophie? She's here, with your sister. She's safe too." He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. His eyes opened again, and this time they were more focused. They took in the luxurious private room, the advanced equipment, and then her, the expensive suit, the pearl earrings, the palpable aura of wealth and power. A deep crease formed between his brows. "Where?" "Massachusetts General," she said softly. "You're going to be fine, Mr. O'Connell. I've made sure of it." She used the same words she'd used with his sister, but this time they felt different. They weren't a statement of power, but a promise, a vow. Miles O'Connell, the carpenter from South Boston, had saved the most precious thing in her life. And Summer Beaumont, the titan of industry, knew that her life was now inextricably linked to his. The chasm between their worlds had been bridged by a single, selfless act of courage, and neither of them would ever be the same. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm. Summer, a woman whose schedule was typically booked 6 months in advance, cleared her calendar. Board meetings were postponed, international calls were rescheduled. Her singular focus became Miles O'Connell's recovery. She visited the hospital every day, a stark figure of corporate elegance in the quiet hum of the recovery wing. At first, her visits were brief and formal. She would inquire about his pain levels, speak with his doctors, and ensure every comfort was provided. She had his room filled with books she thought he might like, ordered meals from Boston's finest restaurants to replace the standard hospital fare, and hired a top-tier physical therapist to be on standby for when he was ready. Miles, for his part, was a reluctant recipient of her overwhelming gratitude. Propped up in his hospital bed, his arm in a heavy sling, he was a man adrift. He was used to being the provider, the fixer, the strong one. This forced passivity, this reliance on the charity of a stranger, however well-intentioned, grated on his pride. "You don't have to do all this," he said one afternoon, his voice stronger now. He gestured with his good hand to the untouched plate of pan-seared scallops on his bedside table. "A cheeseburger would have been fine." Summer, who was seated in a plush armchair by the window, offered a small smile. "I'm not sure the hospital cafeteria's cheeseburgers meet my standards." "They meet mine," he countered, a hint of frustration in his tone. "Mrs. Beaumont, I appreciate everything. I really do. But it's too much." "Please call me Summer," she insisted gently. "And it's not nearly enough. You can't possibly comprehend what you did for me, Mr. O'Connell." "Miles," he said, the name an invitation. "And I didn't do it for you. I did it because there was a little girl in trouble. I'd hope anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she said, her voice dropping, losing its corporate polish and revealing a raw vulnerability. "Everyone else froze. You ran towards the danger. You have to let me do this, Miles. For my own peace of mind, if not for you." The dynamic began to shift during those hospital visits. Fiona, initially wary, started to thaw as she saw the genuine concern in Summer's eyes. She would bring Sophie to the hospital, and Summer would bring Lily. While the adults talked, the two girls would sit in a corner of the big room, their heads bent together. Lily, usually so reserved, would show Sophie her drawings. Sophie, in turn, would whisper her fantastical stories to Lily. They spoke the secret, fluent language of 6-year-olds who had shared a trauma, finding a comfort in each other that no adult could provide. One day, Summer arrived to find Sophie carefully showing Lily how to braid the hair of a doll. Lily, who had never had to share a toy in her life, watched with rapt attention. "Sophie misses her mom a lot," Miles said quietly from the bed, watching them. "She makes up stories about her, that she's a queen in a faraway castle. Robert, my husband, he used to be the storyteller," Summer confessed, her gaze on Lily. "He could spin these incredible tales about talking animals and magical lands. After he died, the stories stopped. I'm not built that way." It was the first time either of them had spoken of their lost spouses. An invisible wall between them crumbled. He was no longer just the hero, and she was no longer just the wealthy beneficiary. They were two single parents navigating the lonely, difficult path of raising a child alone, bound by a shared understanding of profound loss. They started to really talk. He told her about his passion for woodworking, the beauty of finding the story within a piece of raw timber. He spoke of Brenda, his late wife, her infectious laugh and her terrible cooking. Summer, in turn, told him about the crushing pressure of her company, the loneliness of being at the top, and her constant fear that she was failing Lily, providing for her every material need, but starving her of the simple, joyful chaos a family should have. Yesterday, Summer said, a wry twist to her lips, I caught Lily talking to her teddy bear. She told him he was brave, just like the daddy in the park. Miles's breath hitched. He looked at his own hands, one strong and calloused, the other pale and still healing, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the painkillers. When the time came for Miles to be discharged, Summer's planning went into overdrive. She had found out from Fiona that their third-floor walk-up apartment in South Boston would be impossible for him to navigate with his injuries. Absolutely not, she declared. You'll be staying at my guest house until you're fully recovered. The guest house? Miles balked. Summer, I can't. My home, my tools, Sophie's school. I have a town car that can take Sophie to and from school every day. Fiona is welcome to visit anytime. And your tools will be perfectly safe, she said, her tone brokering no argument. The guest house is on the grounds of my home in Beacon Hill. It's private, fully staffed, and has a physical therapist who will come to you daily. It's the only logical solution. Miles knew it was a losing battle. More than that, a small, selfish part of him was exhausted from the struggle. The thought of a quiet place to heal, without the constant worry of mounting bills and missed work, was a siren song he couldn't resist. And so, Miles O'Connell, the carpenter, and his daughter Sophie packed a small bag and were driven in a black Mercedes to the historic gas-lit streets of Beacon Hill. As they passed through the wrought iron gates of Summer Beaumont's estate, a sprawling brick mansion that looked more like a museum than a home, Sophie's eyes were wide with wonder. Daddy, she whispered, looking at the perfectly manicured gardens. Is this a castle? Miles looked at the grand house, then at the smaller, elegant guest house that would be their temporary home. Something like that, sweet pea, he murmured. Something like that. He was a world away from his life, a guest in the orbit of the woman whose daughter he'd saved, and he had no idea how he would ever find his way back, or if he even wanted to. Life in the Beaumont guest house was like living in a gilded cage. It was beautiful, comfortable, and utterly surreal. Miles woke up to the sound of birds in a private garden instead of traffic on West Broadway. A private chef prepared his meals, and his days were structured around physical therapy sessions that were slowly, painstakingly rebuilding the strength in his shattered shoulder. While Miles healed, Detective Harding, a weary but tenacious cop from the Boston PD, continued to dig into the case. Summer had initially assumed Alaric Webb was a random madman. The truth, when Harding delivered it to her in the sterile quiet of her home office, was far more chilling. Mr. Webb wasn't random, Mrs. Beaumont, Harding said, flipping through his notepad. He was a molecular biologist. He worked for a subsidiary of your company, Omnigen, until about 8 months ago. He was fired for ethical violations, falsifying research data. Summer's blood ran cold. I remember the case. He was brilliant, but unstable. We had to let him go. Well, he didn't see it that way, Harding continued. He claimed he was on the verge of a major breakthrough, a gene-editing therapy for a rare pediatric cancer. He believed Omnigen, and by extension you, fired him to steal his research and patent it. He filed lawsuits, made threats. We found a manifesto on his laptop. It was filled with paranoid delusions, all centered on you. Summer sank into her leather chair, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. He was targeting me? Worse, Harding said, his expression grim. He'd been stalking you for months. He knew your routines, your security protocols. He knew he could never get to you directly, so he found your weak spot. Lily, Summer whispered, the name a fragile breath. He knew your nanny took her to the library every Tuesday afternoon. His plan was to take her, to use her as leverage to get his stolen research back. He never intended to kill her, but he was armed and dangerously unstable. What he didn't count on, Harding said, looking out the window towards the guest house, was a random father and his daughter being in the way. The revelation shook Summer to her core. This wasn't a random act of violence that Miles had stumbled into. It was a targeted attack against her family. Miles hadn't just saved a child, he had thrown himself in front of a bullet aimed directly at the heart of her world. The debt she felt she owed him deepened from a vast ocean to an infinite universe. She found Miles in the guest house garden, practicing his range of motion exercises. Sophie and Lily were nearby, building a fairy house at the base of an old oak tree. "The police know why he did it," she said, her voice strained. Miles stopped, sensing the gravity in her tone. "Why?" She told him everything. About Webb, the stolen research, the stalking. As she spoke, Miles's expression shifted from curiosity to a grim, protective anger. He wasn't thinking of himself, but of the two little girls playing just a few yards away. "He was after Lily the whole time," he said, his voice a low growl. "That monster." "He was," Summer confirmed, "which means you didn't just save her from a stray bullet, Miles. You saved her from being kidnapped, or worse. You single-handedly destroyed his entire plan." A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of what-ifs. They both looked over at their daughters, who were now laughing, blissfully unaware of the dark shadow that had almost engulfed them. In that moment, the barriers of wealth and class that still lingered between them seemed to dissolve completely. They were simply two parents united by a fierce, primal need to protect their children. That night, a new and more insidious fear crept into Summer's mind. Webb was in custody, but he was a symptom of a larger disease. Her wealth, her power, her public profile, they all made her a target, and by extension, they made Lily a target. Her security team was the best in the business, but Webb had still found a way to get terrifyingly close. A few days later, Miles was in the main house, having been invited for dinner. He was watching Lily and Sophie play a board game in the grand living room when Summer entered, holding 2 glasses of wine. "I'm upgrading my security," she said, handing him a glass. "New protocols, more personnel, but it doesn't feel like enough. It's like building a higher wall when the threat is already inside." Miles took a sip of wine, his gaze thoughtful as he watched the girls. "The best security isn't always about walls and cameras, Summer. It's about awareness. It's about knowing what looks out of place." He nodded towards the game. "It's like that. You're so focused on the next move, you don't see the whole board." His perspective was so different from that of her highly paid security consultants. They saw threats in data points and risk assessments. He saw them with the instincts of a father and the observational skills of a craftsman. An idea began to form in Summer's mind, an idea that was both audacious and perfectly logical. It was a way to keep her daughter safe and a way to repay Miles in a manner that honored his skills and his pride, rather than treating him like a charity case. "Miles," she began, her voice hesitant, "I want to offer you a job." He turned to her, surprised. "A job?" "Summer, I'm a carpenter. I don't think you have much need for custom cabinets." "Not as a carpenter," she said, her confidence growing. "I want you to be my head of security, not for my company, for my home, for Lily." Miles stared at her, speechless. "You want me to be a bodyguard?" "No," she corrected him. "I have bodyguards. They're great at stopping bullets. I need something more. I need someone who sees the world the way you do. Someone who notices the man in the gray hoodie before he pulls out the gun. Someone who can design a life for Lily that is safe, but not a prison. You have the instincts, the awareness, and," she added, a faint smile on her lips, "you have the one qualification no one else on my payroll has." "What's that?" he asked, still trying to process the offer. "You've already proven you're willing to die for her." The offer hung in the air between them, a life-altering proposition. It was a chance for him to provide for Sophie in a way he'd never dreamed of. But it was more than that. It was a chance to stay in this strange new world, to be near Summer, and to protect the little girl he had already saved once. It meant tying his life, and his daughter's, to theirs in a permanent, profound way. He looked from Summer's earnest, hopeful face to the 2 girls on the floor, their heads together, their laughter filling the vast, silent room. For the first time in a long time, he saw the whole board. Miles accepted the job. It wasn't an easy decision. It meant stepping away from the craft he loved, the familiar scent of sawdust and the independence of his own small business. It meant accepting a role that was born from violence and funded by a gratitude so immense it could feel suffocating. Fiona had been skeptical at first. A security job, Miles? Or a gilded cage? She'd asked, her protective instincts on high alert. But Miles saw it differently. Summer wasn't offering him a handout. She was offering him a purpose that utilized his innate strengths. He spent the first few weeks shadowing her existing security team, learning the protocols, the camera systems, the escape routes. But his true value, as Summer had predicted, came from his unique perspective. He walked the grounds of the estate not as a guard, but as a father. He pointed out blind spots not on a blueprint, but from the eye level of a 6-year-old. He suggested changes not to harden the perimeter, but to soften it, to create an environment where Lily and Sophie could play and explore without feeling watched. He arranged for self-defense and awareness classes for the entire household staff, including Maria, the nanny, empowering them rather than just protecting them. He also found a way to bring his craft with him. In his spare time, he took over a dusty workshop on the estate grounds. His first project was a magnificent handcrafted tree house in the old oak tree, complete with a rope ladder, a small telescope, and 2 little chairs, one painted with sunflowers for Sophie, the other with lilies for Lily. It was a fortress of childhood, a safe haven he had built with his own 2 hands. The guest house was no longer a temporary recovery ward. It became their home. The arrangement was unconventional, but it worked. The line between employer and employee blurred into a friendship, and then slowly and carefully into something more. Their evenings fell into a comfortable routine. After the girls were asleep, Miles and Summer would often sit on the grand terrace overlooking the city lights, talking for hours. They spoke of their dreams for their daughters, their fears, their loneliness. He made her laugh with stories of his disastrous dating attempts after Brenda passed. She confided in him the crushing burden of her legacy and the feeling that she was an imposter in her own life. They were 2 people from opposite ends of the social spectrum, but they found a common ground in their shared values: family, integrity, and a fierce desire to build a better world for their children. One cool October evening, as they sat on the terrace, a comfortable silence settled between them. The treehouse was a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. "Thank you," Summer said softly, breaking the quiet. Miles looked at her, a questioning smile on his face. "For what? I'm just doing my job." "No," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes, which could command boardrooms and intimidate rivals, were soft and full of an emotion he was only just beginning to understand. "Thank you for the treehouse. Thank you for making my daughter laugh again. Thank you for showing me that a home isn't about the size of the walls, but the safety you feel inside them." She paused, taking a breath. "Thank you for running when everyone else stood still." Miles's heart, which he thought had been permanently guarded since losing his wife, felt a distinct, unfamiliar flutter. He reached across the small table between them and took her hand. Her fingers were slender and elegant, but they curled around his calloused ones with a surprising strength. "You don't have to thank me anymore, Summer," he said, his voice low. "What happened that day? It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. It brought us here." In that moment, there was no debt, no gratitude, no employer or employee. There were just 2 people, a man and a woman, who had found each other in the wreckage of a shattered afternoon. They hadn't been looking for love, but it had found them nonetheless, built on a foundation of courage, respect, and the shared laughter of their 2 little girls. The future was unwritten. It would be complicated, navigating their different worlds in the shadows of their past. But as Miles looked at Summer, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the house, he knew he was no longer just protecting her home. He was a part of it. Together, they weren't just a CEO and her head of security, or a hero and the woman he'd saved. They were the beginning of a new family, forged in crisis and built piece by careful piece, like one of his dovetail joints. Strong, seamless, and meant to last a lifetime. The story of Miles and Summer isn't just about a single act of bravery. It's a powerful reminder that heroes aren't defined by the size of their bank accounts or the power they wield, but by the choices they make in a single, unguarded moment. It's about how the most tragic events can sometimes lead to the most beautiful beginnings, bridging worlds we thought were miles apart. It shows us that true connection isn't found in shared circumstances, but in shared values, and that the greatest security a person can have is knowing someone is willing to stand in harm's way for you. If this story of courage, love, and the making of an unexpected family touched your heart, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you were moved, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the goodness that exists in the world. And don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.